He called her, just a waitress. But what she revealed next, shattered his life, his empire, and the lie he built it on. This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about reckoning. Ricardo Vazquez was a man who believed money erased the past. In a restaurant glittering with chandeliers and egos, he sat at the head of a table celebrating his 48th birthday, surrounded by imported wines, silent resentment, and a family too tired to keep pretending. When the waitress arrived, quiet and composed, no one could have imagined that behind her calm eyes lay a storm 15 years in the making. A storm that would expose secrets, tear apart illusions, and force everyone, especially Ricardo, to confront what they'd spent a lifetime burying. There's something strange about power. It's loud when it enters a room, but dead silent when it crumbles. That night, the most exclusive restaurant in the city had closed its doors to the public. Le Jardin Royal, a place so elite you needed connections just to book a weeknight table, belonged to only one man, Ricardo Vazquez. Billionaire real estate mogul, self-made, feared, admired, hated. He liked the silence that came from exclusivity. The silence that whispered, "You are above them," as he adjusted his silk tie in the gilded mirror of the restroom. Ricardo admired the man he had become. Not the boy who once slept on cracked tiles in a Bronx apartment, but the conqueror who turned pain into property, who built skyscrapers out of spite. But the mirror doesn't show you everything. Back at the private dining hall, his wife sat poised in a dress worth a mortgage payment, her smile brittle at the edges. His daughter Andrea, fresh from studying in Boston, tried to hide her contempt behind small talk. His son Diego fiddled with his napkin like it was the only honest thing in the room. Then she walked in, a waitress, maybe 25, hair pulled back, posture like a soldier, eyes calm, but not quiet. She introduced herself as Isabella. Her voice was professional, her presence forgettable, until Ricardo decided she wasn't. He looked at her like she was beneath him. He didn't know she held his past in her pocket. And when he crossed a line, mocking her, daring her, humiliating her, Isabella didn't raise her voice. She raised the truth. What she said next didn't just silence the room. It burned down a kingdom. Speech balloon. Have you ever seen someone in power finally get what they deserve? Tell us in the comments. Would you have stayed silent like Isabella, or would you have spoken out? No matter the cost. Ricardo Vazquez gazed at his reflection in the polished marble wall of the private restroom, smoothing the gleam of his Italian silk tie. The mirrors here weren't merely decorative, they were a testament to his conquest. Each pane whispered a single message: you've arrived. At 48, he had amassed a fortune large enough to silence the boy who once shivered on Bronx sidewalks, replacing poverty's shame with the intoxicating certainty of supremacy. Behind him, in the grand dining hall of Le Jardin Royal, chandeliers sparkled like fallen stars over tables reserved for royalty. Yet none were as royal as Ricardo. He moved through the silken velvet drapes with the confidence of a man who had built skyscrapers from sand, and who believed himself untouchable. Every marble column and crystal lamp validated his triumphs, an empire of real estate, a reign of influence, and a legacy carved in glass and stone. But the applause of silence carried scars his wealth could not erase. In the quiet moments, alone before his mirror throne, he felt the old ache, the sting of childhood ridicule when classmates sneered at holy shoes, the helplessness of watching his mother sew torn hems by candlelight. He had vowed to never be powerless again, channeling humiliation into ambition. Each property deal, each acquisition, was a brick laid upon the foundation of a boy desperate to prove his worth. His family, seated at the long table beyond the drapes, bore witness to both his victories and his vulnerabilities. Patricia, his wife of 20 years, wore a designer gown that sparkled under the chandelier's glow, yet her eyes betrayed the fatigue of someone who had loved a man divided between devotion and dominance. Andrea, their daughter home from Brown University, sipped champagne with forced politeness, her spirit restless against her father's extravagant displays. Diego, their youngest, trailed behind in shadows, torn between admiration and shame. He had learned early that love for this man came at the price of witnessing cruelty masked as confidence. Ricardo's thoughts roared louder than the symphony of clinking glasses and murmured toasts. Why shouldn't I own every inch of this room? He asked himself. Why shouldn't my birthday command the attention of everyone within these walls? His wealth had become his shield, and his weapon. Any perceived weakness, any flicker of dissent, He crushed with pointed remarks or cold indifference. It was the only language he believed the world understood. Yet a single, persistent fear haunted him, the knowledge that a kingdom built on intimidation could crumble when an unexpected challenger appeared. He had vanquished rival developers and silenced boardroom dissent. But what if someone saw beyond the sparkle of his suit? What if an unassuming presence reminded him of the boy he tried so hard to bury? In that moment, his reflection blurred. He straightened his shoulders and brushed a lock of silver-streaked hair from his forehead. He was the unfaltering king of this marble realm, untouchable, unshakable, unrepentant. He inhaled deeply, savoring the cold confidence that swirled through him. And then, without warning, he heard her heels on the polished floor. The sound was almost imperceptible amid the murmur of silverware on china. Yet it sliced through his certainty like a knife. A waitress, slim, poised, her uniform immaculate, walked toward him with an air of composed purpose. She carried a tray as effortlessly as a maestro conducted an orchestra. And her eyes held a clarity that both intrigued and unsettled him. Ricardo's breath caught. He could not have known then that this quiet act of service would mark the first crack in his fortress of power. He would soon discover that true authority did not lie in wealth or intimidation, but in the unwavering strength of one person's dignity. As Isabella Morales took her place at the foot of his table, Ricardo straightened once more, ready to remind her of her place. But beneath his tailored cuff, his pulse throbbed with tension, heralding a confrontation that would shatter mirrors and reveal a truth far more dangerous than the boy he once had been. And so, the stage was set. Ricardo lifted his glass of Dom Perignon, the golden bubbles catching the chandelier light like distant stars. He was preparing his next toast, one that would celebrate his supremacy, when the door to the private dining hall glided open. In stepped a young woman whose poise cut through opulence like a blade through silk. Her name was Isabella Morales. She wore crisp white fabric, an apron tied at her waist, but moved with the grace of someone born to lead, not follow. Each measured step echoed faintly against marble floors. Her dark hair was pulled back in a disciplined bun. Her eyes were calm, almost unreadable. To anyone else, she was just a waitress. To Ricardo, she was a challenge he hadn't anticipated. Isabella approached the table with a tray bearing first course amuse-bouche. Her posture was impeccable, but it was her voice that held him captive, clear, confident, and infused with the slightest trace of something more, perhaps empathy. Perhaps steel. She greeted them with a perfectly measured Spanish accent softened by years of English practice. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Vasquez, Miss Andrea, Mr. Diego. Welcome to Le Jardin Royal. I'm Isabella Morales, and I'll be your server tonight. Ricardo's chest tightened. He expected subservience. The brim of a head bowed in fear. Not this composed dignity. He watched her place a single, jewel-like canapé before him, then turn, never looking away, to Andrea, offering an unwavering smile. Andrea's posture stiffened, but a spark of admiration flickered in her eyes. Inside Isabella, a familiar storm raged. She had practiced this entrance countless times, the gentle bow, the warm greeting, the hidden defiance. 15 years ago, she was a child cradling a faded photograph of her family's home, perfectly intact, before the excavators arrived at dawn. 15 years ago, she learned to swallow her tears, hold her head high, and let kindness be her armor. Tonight, she wore that armor with quiet pride. As she recited the evening's menu, truffle-scented mushroom velouté, seared sea bass with saffron risotto, her words grazed Ricardo's pride like cold water. He interrupted, testing the boundaries. How long have you worked here? 3 months, sir, she replied calmly. And before that? He pressed, voice low. Isabella held his gaze. I've served in kitchens across Madrid and Paris. My priority is excellence. Her answer should have been a defeat, an admission of impermanence, of a journey still in progress. Instead, it radiated purpose. She wasn't hiding or begging, she was claiming space. His next barb, meant to wound, trembled and faded in his throat. Around the table, family tensions simmered. Patricia's grip tightened on her napkin. Andrea's lips parted, ready to defend Isabella. Diego's fingers drummed on the table's edge, furious at his father's cruelty. But Isabella's calm remained unbroken. She moved away with deliberate grace, setting plates with silent precision, as if the world could demand her obedience and find none. Ricardo stared after her retreating figure, mind racing. Who is she, really? He wondered. What made her face the most powerful man in the room without flinching? His empire had taught him to break wills with a single glance. Yet here was a woman whose dignity shone brighter than any crystal chandelier. In the brief solitude of his thoughts, Ricardo felt something he hadn't felt in years: uncertainty. The weight of his achievements suddenly felt hollow. He remembered the nights he spent hunched over contracts, convinced that every square foot he acquired buried a piece of his past shame. But Isabella, she made him question whether power alone could fill the void. Isabella returned, carrying a carafe of vintage Albarino. She paused at Ricardo's side and poured a single taste into his glass. Her hand steady, for the seared sea bass. "Sir," she said softly. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. He saw neither fear nor resentment, only purpose. And in that moment, he realized she was not merely serving a meal, she was setting a trap for his arrogance. He raised his glass to her in a gesture half-smile, then turned away, pride forcing him to conceal his unease. The first notes of tension crackled through the air, a silent duel between unchecked power and unwavering dignity. As Isabella moved on to attend Patricia, Ricardo felt his resolve harden. He would not be undone by a waitress. Yet deep inside, he knew this was only the prelude. Tonight, the stage was set not for a birthday celebration, but for a reckoning. And so, the calm before the storm drifted away, pushing us toward a clash that would shatter mirrors of marble and expose the raw truth beneath. The string quartet fell silent as the first course arrived, delicate mushroom velouté crowned with a swirl of white truffle oil. Ricardo watched Isabella place the bowls before his family, her back as straight as a poem of resilience. In that soft light, every spoonful seemed to echo through the grand hall. He felt the tension rising like bile in his throat. Tonight was not about nourishment, it was about demonstration. He lifted his glass, voice low. "Miss Morales. Impressive resume, but let me ask you, how much do you actually know about hospitality?" Isabella paused, hand hovering over Patricia's plate. Her eyes met his. "Unwavering service," she said, "is rooted in respect, sir, and understanding the people you serve." Ricardo's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Respect? You think respect is earned by kindness? Tell me, do you respect your place here?" He gestured to the private room, to the empty tables beyond velvet ropes. "Or would you rather dine on the privileges you can never afford?" A hush fell. Patricia's hand trembled on her fork. Andrea's knuckles whitened around her glass. Diego's heartbeat thundered in his ears. In that moment, Ricardo believed he held all the cards. He leaned forward. "You're not some equal. You're a paid mouthpiece for a restaurant that rents rooms by the hour. You wouldn't last a week if you worked for me. No leverage. No pedigree." The words spilled like acid. In his mind, he was teaching a lesson. Fear keeps the world in line. But inside, something fractured. He remembered the boy who learned fear too well, afraid of empty wallets, empty promises, empty homes. Isabella's face betrayed nothing, but Andrea saw the flicker, a momentary crack in Ricardo's armor. She opened her mouth to protest, but he silenced her with a look so cold it burned. "Diego," his voice tight, finally spoke. "You're humiliating her, Dad. She hasn't done anything wrong." Ricardo's laughter boomed against the marble. "Wrong? She's wrong for daring to think she deserves respect." He turned back to Isabella. "Tell me, how does it feel to be so dispensable?" In the silent hall, the only sound was the soft clink of a spoon sliding against porcelain. Then, Isabella straightened, her entire being charged with quiet fury. She set Patricia's dish with deliberate care, then met Ricardo's gaze for the first time without flinching. "My family," she began, voice soft but edged with steel, "lost everything because someone like you labeled our lives as dispensable." For a heartbeat, time froze. Ricardo's arrogance stuttered. He saw the truth in her eyes, the girl who once stood in the rubble of her childhood home, determined to rise. He saw the daughter who carried betrayal like a scar, yet refused to be broken. The hush deepened. Patricia blinked back tears. Andrea rose, voice shaking. "Leave her alone." Ricardo slammed his fist on the table, crystal wine glasses singing in protest. "You want sympathy? This is reality. Learn your place." In that instant, something inside him splintered. The roar of his power drowned out the trembling boy within, begging for forgiveness he didn't deserve. He snapped his napkin open and stormed off, leaving Isabella standing at the edge of a battlefield. Around the room, the Vasquez family sat stunned. Torn between loyalty and horror, Andrea reached for Diego's hand. Patricia pressed lips against trembling fingers. Isabella watched Ricardo's departing back. Heart hammering, she felt no triumph, only the weight of what came next. Because cruelty unleashed in public demands a reckoning, and as the door clicked shut behind him, the air itself seemed to crack, ushering the story toward its tipping point. From here, the night shifts from confrontation to revelation, where secret truths will rise. Alliances will fracture, and justice will claim its stage. The hush that fell over Le Jardin Royal was heavier than any symphony. Ricardo's boots had thundered out, but his absence only amplified the quake beneath the crystal walls. Patrons in the bar area peered through glass partitions. Forks paused halfway to trembling lips. The string quartet cleared its throat, uncertain whether to resume. At the head of the table, Andrea's chest heaved with unshed tears. Diego's eyes blazed with anger and helplessness. Patricia's hand shook, as though she balanced a hurricane in her palm. And there, standing before the untouched Vichyssus, was Isabella Morales, the calm at the center of this storm. For a heartbeat, she let the silence stretch, like a bow drawn tight. Then she spoke, voice low and steady. "Mr. Vasquez," she said, pausing to meet each family member's gaze. "You wanted to know why I carry myself this way, why I never flinch, why respect is the only weapon I know." Andrea and Diego sat rigid, as if braced for an explosion. Patricia's knuckles whitened on the tablecloth. Isabella lifted a faded photograph from her apron pocket, a sepia-tinted snapshot of a modest home framed by olive trees. She passed it slowly to Andrea. "This was my family's home," Isabella continued. 10 years ago, before the bulldozers arrived at dawn, before the legal notices, before the world learned to value your investments more than our lives." Andrea's brows knitted. She traced the image's edges. "That's you?" she whispered. Isabella nodded. "That little girl clutching her father's hand. That was me." She inhaled, voice thickening. "My name is Isabella Morales Sandoval. My father led the community of San Jose, 150 families like mine, who built their homes brick by brick, generation after generation. And one night, Mr. Vasquez, your lawyers reclassified our land as environmental hazard, forcing us to sell at a fraction of its worth." Murmurs rippled around the table. Patricia's eyes glistened. Diego sat forward, as if Stevie had shouted, "Listen." Isabella's gaze sharpened. "My father was arrested on false charges, incitement, conspiracy, because he refused to accept the bribes you offered." Her lips trembled, but she pressed on. "He died in a cell. Heartbroken. My mother worked 3 jobs to feed us. I watched my childhood crumble. And in those ruins I made a vow. I would rise. And I would speak." She returned the photo to her pocket and stood tall. "Tonight, you humiliated me in front of my family. My friends, your own family. But you do not know me. You never did." Silence fell like ash. Ricardo's retreat had only delayed this moment. In his empty seat, the ghost of his power lingered. Patricia choked a sob. Andrea's voice quavered. I had no idea." Isabella offered no forgiveness. "I am not here for apologies. I am here for justice." Diego's fist slammed into the table. "You destroyed our home, Mr. Vasquez. How many more lives did you uproot?" The question hung in the air, pregnant with accusation. Across the room, the manager hovered, his face pale as fine porcelain, grappling with whether to intervene or bear witness. Isabella's chest rose and fell with quiet strength. She reached into her apron again and pulled out a stack of legal documents bound by a blood-red ribbon. "These files contain every wire transfer, every bribery memo, every manipulated permit. For 2 years I gathered evidence. Tonight, I give you a choice." Patricia gasped. Andrea's hand shot to her mouth. Even the quartet had stilled their bows. Isabella held Ricardo's gaze, though he was gone. His influence remained in every opulent detail. "You can sign a settlement, 80% of your net worth returned to the families you destroyed. A fund to rebuild San Jose, and a public admission of wrongdoing. Or," she paused, letting the gravity sink in, "we file these documents with the district attorney by morning. Your empire will crumble under its own corruption." The crystal walls seemed to tremble. Wealth and privilege glittered around them. But none could outshine this raw, unyielding truth. Patricia covered her face with both hands. Andrea and Diego reached for each other. In that suspended moment, an unspoken realization passed through the Vasquez clan. Their power, like the finest crystal, could shatter at the exact point it was most brilliant. Isabella folded her arms, the fire of justice burning in her eyes, and allowed the room to breathe once more. The reveal had leveled the playing field. What remained was the reckoning. Isabella stood before the Vasquez family, a woman transformed by grief and purpose. In her hands she held two thick folders, bound in crimson ribbon. One bore the signatures of more than 100 displaced San Jose families. The other contained binding legal agreements and financial projections. The crystal chandeliers above seemed to flicker as if caught between condemnation and hope. She offered the first folder to Ricardo's attorney, a sharply dressed man whose pristine suit belied his unease. "This," she said, voice steady but tender, "is the civil claim for damages, fraud, corruption, conspiracy. The evidence is irrefutable: bank statements, sworn affidavits, recorded conversations. If Mr. Vasquez chooses not to settle, we file tomorrow morning. The case will proceed, and his empire will be scrutinized in open court." The attorney swallowed. Patricia's knuckles whitened on the table's velvet edge. Andrea gasped. Diego's breath caught. Ricardo, seated like a condemned king, stared at the documents, every instinct screaming to fight. But he sensed the tide had turned. Isabella then extended the second folder, her gaze sweeping the room. "Or," she continued, "Mr. Vasquez may sign this settlement agreement, 80% of his net worth directed immediately into a restitution fund for San Jose, enough to rebuild homes, schools, and livelihoods. The remainder, fortified by investment strategies guided by the very families he wronged, will ensure long-term community growth. In exchange, all criminal charges will be deferred, pending fulfillment of these terms." A pregnant silence followed. Ricardo's family looked at him, torn between relief that this horror might end, and disbelief at the cost. Patricia's eyes brimmed. Tears traced silent pathways down her cheeks. Andrea's voice broke as she whispered, "What will become of us?" Isabella's voice softened. "Your family's financial security will be guaranteed through a separate trust. Protected from litigation, you will not be left destitute. Children deserve a future unmarred by their parents' mistakes." Diego pressed his lips together, swallowing. His father's empire, once the bedrock of their identity, now threatened to crumble under the weight of its own sins. Ricardo closed his eyes, recalling the boy he'd been, hungry, hollow, desperate for validation. He'd traded compassion for control, justice for profit. Now, the very power he wielded had become his cage. His heart thundered with conflicting urges: fight, denounce, cling to every last dollar, or yield, rebuild, and prove there could be more than regret. He saw his wife's hand tremble as she reached for Andrea's, and his children's faces, loyal yet wounded. At last, Ricardo placed a trembling hand on the settlement folder. The ribbon sat and whispered beneath his fingertips. He met Isabella's eyes, no triumph, only the steady promise of accountability. I will sign," he said, voice husky with emotion. A wave of exhalation swept the room. Patricia exhaled softly, leaning into Andrea. Diego's shoulders relaxed ever so slightly. Isabella gave a small nod, her own tears glinting like morning dew. This act was not mercy, it was redemption. As attorneys gathered to finalize the agreement, Ricardo's mind shifted inward. He felt a weight lift, a burden he'd carried since childhood humiliation. Yet he also recognized another truth. Restitution was not absolution. True redemption would require years of atonement, effort, and humility. Isabella collected the signed pages with care. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, "the world will learn your choice. But change begins now." She glanced at Patricia. "You may have questions." Patricia drew a shaky breath, steeling herself. "How do we begin to rebuild trust?" Isabella's eyes softened. "By listening." Andrea and Diego exchanged hopeful looks. In that promise lay the seed of a new chapter, one in which power would not dominate, but uplift. The ink had dried, but the real work lay ahead, tearing down old walls and building bridges brick by honest brick. Dawn broke over the site of what was once desolation, the empty lot where bulldozers had once torn through San Jose's heart. Now, the air smelled of fresh pine beams and damp earth. Children's laughter echoed off half-constructed walls. Somewhere, hammers tapped out a hopeful rhythm. Ricardo Vasquez knelt in the mud, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, pressing a brick into mortar. His tailored suits had been replaced by work boots and a high-visibility vest. The weight of the brick was heavier than any briefcase he had ever lifted. Yet it grounded him in a way no skyscraper ever could. He looked up to see Isabella Morales guiding a group of architects and residents as they adjusted the blueprint for a community center. Her voice carried both authority and warmth, qualities he had once believed were mutually exclusive. In that moment, he understood that true leadership was not about commanding from a throne, but collaborating on the ground. His family worked around him. Patricia planted rose bushes beside the new clinic, her hands careful as if nurturing both soil and forgiveness. Andrea painted a mural celebrating the heritage of San Jose's families, children playing under olive trees, parents sharing meals. Diego hammered nails into a wooden bench, focused and determined, as though each strike redeemed his father's past misdeeds. Ricardo's chest throbbed with a complex blend of humility and purpose. He felt the sting of guilt every time he recalled the bulldozers that once uprooted these same streets. But that guilt had transformed into resolve. Each brick he laid now was a promise that no family would suffer as his did, that no child would lose their home for profit. He paused, brick in hand, and closed his eyes. In the quiet between the traffic of construction, he heard his inner voice, the scared boy who believed only in power. That boy was still there, but he was no longer alone. He had a choice: continue to wield wealth as a weapon, or use it to heal. Ricardo opened his eyes and placed the brick. It settled perfectly. A smile, genuine and unforced, flickered across his face. Nearby, Isabella approached, wiping sweat from her brow. "We need to adjust the north wing's overhang," she said, pointing to a sun-drenched facade. "The summer sun is harsh. Families need shade." He nodded. "Show me," he replied. She gestured, and together they studied the plans, tracing lines with calloused fingers. He marveled at how her expert eye, once targeted by his cruelty, now guided his only chance at redemption. As they worked, the sun climbed higher, illuminating the scene. Former adversaries turned partners, children reclaiming space stolen from them, a community uniting around new foundations. It was nothing like the silent grandeur of marble and mirrors. It was messy, it was alive, it was real. Later, as the day cooled, Patricia gathered everyone for a simple dinner beneath rows of newly planted orange trees. Bowls of hearty stew and fresh bread were passed hand to hand. Andrea read aloud from a community charter that guaranteed fair housing and educational programs. Diego surprised Ricardo by toasting him for choosing people over profit. Ricardo rose, voice thick with emotion. "I spent decades believing my wealth defined me. I was wrong. True wealth," he said, glancing at the faces he had once sought to impress, "lies in the lives we touch, the hope we build, and the trust we restore. Today, I understand that building something meaningful is harder than tearing it down, but infinitely more rewarding." A hush fell as his words sank in. Then applause rippled through the crowd, gentle, heartfelt, a far cry from the hollow cheers of his old world. In that moment, under the orange blossoms, Ricardo felt something new stir in his soul: peace. Not the peace born of comfort or dominance, but the deeper peace of purpose and belonging. His journey from boyhood humiliation to ruthless mogul to humbled steward had come full circle. He caught Isabella's eye. Her nod was a silent benediction. The woman who had once shattered his illusions now stood by his side as an equal, a partner in creation rather than conflict. The orange grove shimmered in the last light of day, and Ricardo took a breath of that fresh, hopeful air. He did not know what tomorrow would bring. Perhaps new challenges, old doubts, moments of weakness, but for the first time, he faced the future not with arrogance, but with resolve. He understood now: to build something lasting, you must be willing to break and remake yourself 1,000 times over. And in that endless process of growth, you find the richest treasure of all: a life of meaning, woven through community, compassion, and shared dreams. As twilight descended on San Jose, the faint glow of newly installed street lamps guided families home. In the distance, the outline of a new community center rose against the dusky sky, a beacon of hope born from the unlikeliest of beginnings.